When it comes to design, you're pretty much going to get premium either way. It just matters what kind of material you're going for. In the case of the Samsung Galaxy Note 5, we now have a metal frame with a unibody that employs dual glass panels. What's nice is that there is a curve to the backing, so it does sit really nicely in the hand, but this unibody also means that there are no more removable backs, and that means no more replaceable batteries or expandable storage. But really from there, you have a lot of the same elements, including the S Pen, which is nestled right down here in the corner and now has a clicky top, so it is able to be in there completely recessed. You still get the same button layout all over the place, and really this feels like a still Samsung-esque device. On the other hand, we have the Nexus 6P, which takes on a new design now head by Huawei. And Huawei has done a great job in providing a big metal redesign on here that provides a very premium look and feel. You even have that black bar on the top, which houses the camera and its accessories, but of course it's all about this fingerprint reader here on the back that is able to wake and unlock the device simply by putting your finger on that area. 5.7 inches is what you get in both of these devices, and the Nexus 6P is just that little bit bigger overall than the Galaxy Note 5, but it doesn't really hinder its handling all that much. For the most part, you're going to get a very similar experience here, even though the curve on the back here does make this sit a little bit more nicely. The flat sides of the Nexus 6P also help its case as well. But we have very similar specifications when it comes to the displays. Quad HD is the name of the game here, and you get very high resolution no matter which of these two devices you pick. Now, we do have a Super AMOLED display on the Galaxy Note 5, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is really all that much better than the AMOLED display on the Nexus 6P. We get a very similar color output on here with a bit of a punch up in those colors due to the saturation, but from there, it's still a great display experience either way for both work and play. Now, one thing that the Nexus 6P is able to boast is the ambient display, which does come up when you bring the phone up from, let's say, a table or the prone position. It is kind of nice to have so you can get a quick look at your notifications, but it's not the easiest thing to trigger. When it comes to performance, we have a great experience either way, but they both come from different sources. The Samsung Galaxy Note 5 now employs the Samsung in-house Exynos 7420 processor along with 3 GB of RAM, which should definitely help with multitasking. Now, it is very worthy to mention that TouchWiz still has a lot of features that are not found in stock Android, so multitasking is really its kind of forte. You will be able to use the multi-window and also the S-window capabilities, but for the most part, going through all of the typical tasks in the home screens, apps, and even gaming did not bring us any issues whatsoever in the Note 5, and it still provides a very reliable experience. But on the other hand, the tried and true Snapdragon 810 and 3 GB of RAM as well are what powers the Nexus 6P, and it does so beautifully. We do give a little bit of credit to the Android iteration on here because it is stock Android with all the optimizations that Marshmallow has put in. You really aren't going to have any problems on here, though you are not going to have as much multitasking because the recent app screen is the main way to use the Nexus 6P. That said, the interface and all the applications go by swimmingly, so the experience of the stock Android on the Nexus 6P is really one of the most sublime experiences we've had in Android this year. Now, the core basics when it comes to the hardware section are actually kind of similar when it comes to these two devices. After all, the Samsung Galaxy Note 5 this year no longer has the removable backing, so you don't get expandable storage or even a replaceable battery. So that kind of puts it in line with what we have already been used to in the Nexus line. But of course, the main addition in the Galaxy Note 5 is going to be the S Pen, which pops out very nicely because the pen itself, while very symmetrical, also has a very addicting clicky top. And it is really easy to use when you're using the stylus experience on here. Just remember, don't be putting this pen in backwards. The speaker on the bottom is not all that great, to be honest. It does provide a little bit more body than plenty of other devices, but it is also not quite as loud as some iterations. But it pales in comparison simply to the dual front-facing speakers of the Nexus 6P. For that matter, however, the connections are all pretty much the same on here, and the fingerprint reader inside of the home button is really easy to use. You are going to have to press the home button to wake the device, but leaving the finger on there will unlock it pretty quickly. And from there, you also get for charging, wireless charging, which Samsung has said is one of the fastest iterations out there, but you still have the micro USB port on the bottom here, which is able to do fast charging, so you won't be having to charge too often when it only takes about 10 to 15 minutes to be able to get past the rest of your day. As we move on to the Nexus 6P, the first thing we can talk about is that fingerprint reader on the back. Now it's that little circle there, and once you have your fingerprint set up, you just have to put a finger onto that area and it will wake and unlock the device simultaneously, which makes it just that little bit faster than the Samsung Galaxy Note 5. And then when going to the front, we have the dual stereo front-facing speakers on here, which are a treat no matter what device we see them on, and they work really well in the 6P. We don't really have to have our headphones out when we were playing games mostly, because the sound from these two speakers already provides a nice experience. A lot of the same connections are also still available here in the Nexus 6P, but you're not going to get wireless charging on here, which is a little bit of a bummer. But actually, the 3450 mAh battery on here can go for quite a while, just that little bit more than the Galaxy Note 5, especially when you factor in Marshmallow's new Doze feature. And then finally here on the USB Type-C port, which is the new standard that we do have to get a little bit more used to still, we also have the higher powered currents that, even if it's not going to be using Qualcomm's Quick Charge 2.0, it's still able to provide a really fast charging experience. This 3450 mAh battery might seem large, but going from 0 to 100 in the charge only takes about 90 minutes. So for both of these devices, we have a good outlook when it comes to hardware, but when it comes to the Galaxy Note 5, you obviously have the stylus experience, and if that's what you really need, then you can go ahead and choose the Samsung device. But the Nexus 6P is definitely proving that it is very good for even the power user. And in camera, we are dealing with two very powerful packages on here. The Nexus 6P is the one that probably got the more profound upgrade, however, because it now brings great camera quality, whereas the rest of the Nexus line just paled in comparison to the rest of Android. A larger sensor is able to pull in 13 megapixels worth of data, and you'll be able to get those pictures along with an 8 megapixel front-facing shooter for those selfies. But when we're talking about the application, there aren't too many controls on here, definitely no manual controls, and as far as the modes go, we do have a nice auto HDR plus mode and also really good slow motion capture at lower resolutions. But as far as other modes go, we have things like lens blur and photosphere with not too many extras after that. But that is what the Samsung camera is able to boast. Now, though it does have a 16 megapixel shooter, it is also with optical image stabilization, which the Nexus 6P does not have, and its front-facing shooter is of 5 megapixels. But its application provides a lot of control. Not only are you able to add a lot of different modes onto there, but when you go to the Pro mode, you are able to change, even in minute increments, things like the white balance and the ISO. So from there, you have a lot of great features that Samsung has commonly put into its cameras. But we are always looking at picture quality here, and to that end, we have these examples. We'll start off with the low light shots, of which we actually think that the optical image stabilization is able to pull a more usable shot than the larger sensor of the Nexus 6P. But that is, of course, with the combination of a very steady hand, if you can do it, along with a night mode that tries to pull in a little bit more light in a longer exposure. But when it comes to general pictures, we actually thought that both of the cameras provided really great pictures. The Nexus 6P does tend to have that little bit more sharpness in its photos, and the Galaxy Note 5 is kind of putting a bit of a warm hue over all of its photos, so the color profile might be just very slightly different. That said, however, both pictures are really enjoyable and you should have a lot of fun with it, so it kind of comes down to how much control you want to have over them. That warmish hue that we see on the Galaxy Note 5 can be alleviated, of course, in the Pro mode. So you can really kind of take your pick here, but at the very least, in the auto modes with auto HDR available, you should be able to get some nice photos no matter which of these two devices you pick. And finally, in software, we have two versions of Android here. The Lollipop version of TouchWiz on here, that is Samsung's usually kind of oversaturated in features software suite, and then we have Marshmallow on here, the stock Android, the pure experience of Android. Now, we will start off with the Nexus 6P, which has the stock Android experience, and if you've ever had one before, you kind of know what to expect here. There are a few subtle changes, however, with an extra line on the app drawer that provides your most used applications, app permissions so you can get an extra layer of security, and the flashiest of the new features now on tap, which by holding the home button, you will be able to look for certain terms that are currently shown on the screen. Now, the thing is, though, that the Android Marshmallow iteration on here is all about its speed and snappiness. And of course, when you're going to be getting a Nexus device, you're also going to be getting a lot of updates for the foreseeable future that are available before plenty of the other carriers. But that said, however, speaking of the carriers and manufacturers, Samsung has put a slightly toned down TouchWiz on onto the Galaxy Note 5, which of course uses as its mark the S Pen. But before we get to that, we still have the multitasking capabilities of the multi-window, which is easily triggered from the already existing recent app screen, and of course the S window if you want to drag down to a floating window. But from there, TouchWiz pretty much looks and feels the way that it always has, but you can of course theme it if you want to. But it's all about this S Pen right here, which does provide a stylus and more executive-like experience if you so needed to. Pulling out the S Pen from here will open up the Air Command menu, and there are a few key functions on there, including the ability to go straight to S Note by using the action memo and writing down any number of things that could then contextually be put into other applications. Smart Select is one of our favorites because it's able to pull any little portion of the screen, and then it provides a very easy way of sharing it. And then of course the Screen Write, which now can also take scrollable web pages. But really the best part about using the S Pen is that if the phone is actually in standby and off, when you pull out the S Pen, this becomes a blank slate, and you can actually write anything on here that will then become part of S Note, and you can always use that for further reminders later on. Now, it is worthy of mention that the Nexus 6P, despite having a great and mostly updated version of Android, has features that will eventually make it to the other phones, and Samsung is no exception. It just has to take a little bit longer for it to provide those updates for their users' phones, like for example mine, which is still on Lollipop. But if you want a very saturated in-feature software suite, then of course you have multitasking abilities and that S Pen here in the Note 5. So unless you really want those extra ways of doing your work and play, you still will have a great experience on the Nexus 6P doing the conventional and more original ways of all those things. For the base models on these two devices, we're dealing with 32 gigabytes, and true to form, the Nexus 6P is available at the Google Store for $499 starting off. Now, if you want to go to the Galaxy Note 5, we'll use T-Mobile as an example, where there, after monthly payment, you'll be paying a total of $699. And so there you have it for the Nexus 6P and the Samsung Galaxy Note 5. Now, it was pretty easy before in the Nexus line to say you kind of get what you pay for when comparing them to the flagships of the Samsung camp. But now that's not really the case, as with Huawei, Google has been able to provide kind of the real flagship experience if stock Android is your measuring stick. But if you already know what version of Android you're looking for, then the choice is really easy. No matter which one you choose, however, you get very premium devices here, and you aren't going to have any problems getting anything done, no matter which one you pick.